When you spend your days fixing old machines, you start to believe anything broken can be repaired if you just take enough time. That's what I used to think about relationships, too. Grease under the fingernails, scars on the knuckles, none of it scared me. What scared me was silence. The kind that settles between two people who once finished each other's sentences. Claire and I met at a farmer's market 2 summers before it ended. She was selling handmade candles, the kind that came with little poems printed on recycled paper. I was there picking up parts from a guy who restored vintage tools. Somehow we struck up a conversation about the smell of old oil versus lavender wax, and she told me I had working-class poetry in my hands. I didn't know what that meant, but she said it with a smile that felt like sunlight. For 2 years we built a life that felt solid, even if it was lopsided. I worked long hours at the garage, and on weekends I restored motorcycles in my own shop, a converted barn behind my rental house. She painted in the spare room we called her studio, though most of the time she used the space to take pictures of herself with paintbrushes in her hair for social media. I didn't mind. Everyone needs a stage. She liked that I was grounded, that I could fix things she didn't understand, leaky faucets, jammed windows, her car that always refused to start in the rain. And I liked that she made ordinary life feel like a story worth telling. We ate takeout on the porch, argued about music, shared coffee every morning. I thought that was enough. But somewhere around our second spring together, Claire began to drift toward a world that didn't have room for me. She started calling herself a creative soul, like it was a title she'd earned. Her new friends were artists, designers, people who used words like authenticity and energy while sipping overpriced wine. I tried to keep up, but after a while it felt like she was speaking another language, one that used to include me but no longer did. The first time I noticed the shift, she was talking about an art retreat upstate. She described it like a pilgrimage, a chance to reconnect with the real me. I asked if the real her included me, and she smiled without answering. The smile told me everything. We didn't fight. Not at first. We just became polite. She came home later each night, smelling like paint thinner and someone else's cologne. I'd sit in the garage, hands covered in oil, listening to the same song on repeat because it was easier than thinking. By the time summer came, I'd stopped asking where she was going. I told myself love was supposed to give freedom, not fences. What I didn't realize was that she'd already left, she just hadn't told me yet. The night it happened, I was finishing a rebuild of a 1969 Triumph Bonneville. Claire walked into the garage wearing a dress I'd never seen before, flowy abstract, like something torn from a gallery painting. Her hair was pinned up, her face calm in that practiced way people get when they've rehearsed bad news. She said she'd been thinking a lot about her art, her path, and how she needed space to grow. I wiped my hands on a rag and waited for the part where she'd say we'd work it out. It never came. She told me she'd met people who understood her energy, that she couldn't stay in something that felt ordinary. Ordinary. That word landed heavier than any insult could. I wanted to laugh, because what's more ordinary than running away from a good thing because it's steady? But I didn't. I just nodded. Then she said it, the line that would echo for months. We'll always be friends, though. She meant it like a peace offering, but it sounded like an afterthought. A ribbon on a goodbye gift no one wanted. I smiled, calm and careful, like a man handling something fragile and sharp. Of course, I said. And I meant it, just not the way she thought. That night she packed a few things, kissed my cheek like a stranger, and left. I stayed in the garage long after her car disappeared, staring at the motorcycle gleaming under the work light. It looked finished, but I couldn't bring myself to start it. The hum of the engine would have sounded too much like a heartbeat. When dawn came, I went inside. Her paintings were gone, but her coffee mug sat by the sink, lipstick mark still fresh. I washed it, dried it, and put it in the cabinet. Then I went back to work. Because that's what I knew how to do, fix what was left. When you spend your days fixing old machines, you start to believe anything broken can be repaired if you just take enough time. That's what I used to think about relationships, too. Grease under the fingernails, scars on the knuckles, none of it scared me. What scared me was silence. The kind that settles between two people who once finished each other's sentences. Claire and I met at a farmer's market 2 summers before it ended. She was selling handmade candles, the kind that came with little poems printed on recycled paper. I was there picking up parts from a guy who restored vintage tools. Somehow we struck up a conversation about the smell of old oil versus lavender wax, and she told me I had working-class poetry in my hands. I didn't know what that meant, but she said it with a smile that felt like sunlight. For 2 years we built a life that felt solid, even if it was lopsided. I worked long hours at the garage, and on weekends I restored motorcycles in my own shop, a converted barn behind my rental house. She painted in the spare room we called her studio, though most of the time she used the space to take pictures of herself with paintbrushes in her hair for social media. I didn't mind. Everyone needs a stage. She liked that I was grounded, that I could fix things she didn't understand, leaky faucets, jammed windows, her car that always refused to start in the rain. And I liked that she made ordinary life feel like a story worth telling. We ate takeout on the porch, argued about music, shared coffee every morning. I thought that was enough. But somewhere around our second spring together, Claire began to drift toward a world that didn't have room for me. She started calling herself a creative soul, like it was a title she'd earned. Her new friends were artists, designers, people who used words like authenticity and energy while sipping overpriced wine. I tried to keep up, but after a while it felt like she was speaking another language, one that used to include me but no longer did. The first time I noticed the shift, she was talking about an art retreat upstate. She described it like a pilgrimage, a chance to reconnect with the real me. I asked if the real her included me, and she smiled without answering. The smile told me everything. We didn't fight. Not at first. We just became polite. She came home later each night, smelling like paint thinner and someone else's cologne. I'd sit in the garage, hands covered in oil, listening to the same song on repeat because it was easier than thinking. By the time summer came, I'd stopped asking where she was going. I told myself love was supposed to give freedom, not fences. What I didn't realize was that she'd already left, she just hadn't told me yet. The night it happened, I was finishing a rebuild of a 1969 Triumph Bonneville. Claire walked into the garage wearing a dress I'd never seen before, flowy abstract, like something torn from a gallery painting. Her hair was pinned up, her face calm in that practiced way people get when they've rehearsed bad news. She said she'd been thinking a lot about her art, her path, and how she needed space to grow. I wiped my hands on a rag and waited for the part where she'd say we'd work it out. It never came. She told me she'd met people who understood her energy, that she couldn't stay in something that felt ordinary. Ordinary. That word landed heavier than any insult could. I wanted to laugh, because what's more ordinary than running away from a good thing because it's steady? But I didn't. I just nodded. Then she said it, the line that would echo for months. We'll always be friends, though. She meant it like a peace offering, but it sounded like an afterthought. A ribbon on a goodbye gift no one wanted. I smiled, calm and careful, like a man handling something fragile and sharp. Of course, I said. And I meant it, just not the way she thought. That night she packed a few things, kissed my cheek like a stranger, and left. I stayed in the garage long after her car disappeared, staring at the motorcycle gleaming under the work light. It looked finished, but I couldn't bring myself to start it. The hum of the engine would have sounded too much like a heartbeat. When dawn came, I went inside. Her paintings were gone, but her coffee mug sat by the sink, lipstick mark still fresh. I washed it, dried it, and put it in the cabinet. Then I went back to work. Because that's what I knew how to do, fix what was left. The first week after she left was quiet in a way I didn't expect. No arguments, no tears, just silence stretching through the house like fog. I kept waiting for grief to hit, but it didn't. Not yet. Instead, there was this strange calm, like when a storm finally breaks and the air feels heavy but still. She texted a few times, little check-ins about mail, a bill in her name, a plant she forgot. I answered politely. No anger, no warmth either. Just short, practical replies. I figured that was what friends did. A month later, she called. Said she missed talking to me. I told her I was still around if she needed a friend. She hesitated before saying, "You've always been so good to me, Ethan." I thanked her and hung up. That's when I understood what she really meant by friendship. She wanted the comfort without the commitment, the safety net without the weight of responsibility. She wanted the same Ethan who fixed her car, listened to her rants, paid for takeout when her art didn't sell. She wanted emotional service with none of the cost. So I decided to take her words literally. We'd be friends, but the kind who don't owe each other anything. The next time her car broke down, she called in a panic from the side of the road. I was halfway through rebuilding an engine and said I couldn't leave the shop. Maybe call a tow truck. She laughed awkwardly, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. 2 hours later, she sent another message. Got it towed. So expensive, lol. I replied. Glad you're safe. That was it. No apology, no lecture. Just quiet boundaries forming like steel around me. Over the next few weeks, her texts came less often but carried more tension. A "hey" would be followed by a "you seem distant," then a "hope you're okay." I kept my responses measured, friendly, distant, unshakable. Meanwhile, I started noticing how much lighter life felt without the constant tightrope of her moods. The house was messy but peaceful. The fridge was full because no one was buying overpriced cheese for creative boards. I started waking up early again, making coffee, and actually tasting it. At the garage, the guys noticed. You look different, one said. I told him I'd been getting more sleep. He nodded, not prying. That's the thing about men who work with their hands, we notice change, but we don't dissect it. One Saturday, I saw Claire downtown at a cafe. She was with a group of new friends, artists, photographers, all in black, laughing too loud. She spotted me through the window and waved. I waved back. She came outside, all perfume and nervous energy, talking about her new project and how free she felt. I just listened, smiling in that polite way you do when you know someone's performance isn't for you anymore. She mentioned she was struggling with rent, that her commissions weren't steady. She laughed about the starving artist's life, waiting for me to offer help. I didn't. When she hugged me goodbye, she lingered a little too long. You're still my favorite person, she said softly. I smiled. That's what friends are for. Driving home, I realized she'd never seen the difference between kindness and dependence. She thought being loved meant being rescued. Maybe that's why she left, to feel like the hero of her own story. But friendship, the way I saw it now, wasn't about saving anyone. It was about knowing when not to. That night I opened the garage, turned on the radio, and let the music fill the space. The Triumph was finally ready. I started the engine. The sound roared alive, rough, beautiful, unbroken. For the first time in months, I felt the same way. When Claire left, I thought I'd spend months trying to adjust to life without her. What I didn't expect was how quickly routine filled the space she'd occupied. Mornings became simple again. I woke up, made coffee, fed the neighbor's dog that liked to wander into my yard, and opened the garage. Metal, grease, and the smell of gasoline, they became my therapy. I wasn't happy exactly, but I was steady. Claire, on the other hand, started showing up in the background of my life like a song I'd deleted but couldn't stop hearing. Her name popped up on my phone now and then, never for anything meaningful. Just, "Hey, how've you been?" Or, "Remember that old record we used to play?" At first, I answered. Short messages, nothing personal. After a while, I stopped replying altogether. That's when she started showing up in person. The first time was at the hardware store. She happened to be there, looking for picture hooks. She smiled, asked about the shop, said she missed the smell of oil on my hands. I just nodded and wished her luck with her art show. A week later, she texted to ask if I still had my old truck. Hers wouldn't start, and she needed a ride to her exhibit. I told her I couldn't. The truck was in pieces for a rebuild. Which wasn't true. It sat in the driveway, perfectly fine. But friendship, I'd learned, didn't include free roadside service. She replied with a single word, "Oh." After that, the messages slowed, but the cracks in her new life started showing. Mutual friends mentioned she'd been struggling to pay rent. Her collective art space wasn't making money, and the group she'd moved in with had kicked her out after some argument about unpaid utilities. She posted online about creative burnout, about how people didn't appreciate real art. I recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when the world didn't bend to her will, wounded but self-righteous. I didn't gloat. Not out loud. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like balance, like gravity finally doing its job. By late autumn, she showed up at my shop. I was under a bike when I heard her voice, soft, familiar, carrying that hint of performative exhaustion. She said she'd been thinking about how good we used to be. I rolled out from under the bike, wiped my hands, and asked what she needed. She looked around, her eyes landing on the tools, the engine, the order. She said she missed this kind of stability, the smell of work, the simplicity of purpose. I told her it's still here, just not for her anymore. That stung. I could see it. But I kept my tone even. She asked if we could grab coffee sometime, just to catch up. I agreed, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity. I wanted to see how she'd spin her story now that she was no longer the muse, just a memory. At the cafe, she talked about herself, mostly. How her art had been misunderstood. How her creative circle had become toxic. Every complaint sounded like an excuse she'd rehearsed. When the bill came, she hesitated just long enough for me to notice. I left it there on the table, untouched. She reached for her purse, embarrassed. That's when I saw it, the smallest crack in her confidence. Not a collapse, just the beginning of one. After that day, she didn't reach out for a while. Maybe pride kept her away, or maybe she finally realized I wasn't the same man she'd left behind. Either way, the silence suited me. But silence has a funny way of making people talk louder in other places. I started hearing about her from others, how she tried freelancing, then bartending, then teaching art classes at the community center. None of it stuck. She moved apartments twice, borrowed money from friends, and started dating a photographer who, by all accounts, treated her like a project. I didn't celebrate her downfall. I just kept my distance, watched it all unfold from the calm center of my own rebuilt life. One night in December, she called again. Said she was at her wit's end. Her words came out in shaky bursts, something about losing her apartment, about how unfair everything felt. She said she just needed someone who understood her. I listened quietly, leaning against the cold wall of my garage, the phone pressed to my ear. When she finished, I told her I was sorry to hear that I hoped things would get better. Then I said goodnight and hung up. No anger. No pity. Just finality. The next morning, I found her old mug in the cabinet, the one with the chipped rim and faded design. I took it out, filled it with coffee, and sat by the window. The air smelled like winter and diesel. I thought about how strange it is, the way people can love you for what you give them, and resent you when you stop. By the end of that week, I stopped thinking about her altogether. At least, that's what I told myself. The real change came later, not from her collapse, but from what came after. Because while Claire was falling apart, someone else was quietly stepping into my life. Someone I'd overlooked without realizing it. Her name was Sophie. She'd been Claire's roommate for a short time before the breakup, quiet, neat, the kind of woman who didn't fill silence with noise. When they lived together, Claire used to call her boring. The word meant nothing to me back then. Now, it felt like peace. I ran into Sophie one afternoon at the grocery store. She looked surprised to see me but smiled politely. Said she'd heard about Claire leaving, and that she hoped I was okay. I told her I was doing fine, rebuilding an old Harley, staying busy. She laughed softly, said that sounded like me. There was something steady in her eyes, the kind of steadiness that doesn't need to prove anything. She didn't ask about Claire. She didn't dig for gossip. She just said it was good to see me and went back to comparing prices on vegetables. That small, ordinary moment lingered with me longer than any of Claire's grand speeches ever did. It wasn't love, not yet. It was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement between two people who understood the difference between noise and substance. I went home that evening and worked on the Harley until midnight. The sound of the tools, the hum of the heater, the rhythm of metal meeting purpose, it all felt like clarity. Claire's world was crumbling, and mine was just beginning to make sense. I've always believed that real change doesn't arrive like lightning. It creeps in quietly, like the slow turning of a wrench until something finally loosens. That's how it was with Sophie. After that grocery store meeting, I didn't expect to see her again. But small towns have their own gravitational pull. Everyone ends up orbiting each other eventually. 2 weeks later, I saw her again at the diner near the garage, sitting alone with a notebook and a mug of coffee that had probably gone cold. She noticed me, smiled, and waved me over. I joined her, not because I was lonely, but because something about her stillness felt like an invitation to breathe. We talked, though talked isn't the right word. It was more like trading small pieces of quiet honesty. She told me she'd moved out of the apartment she'd once shared with Claire, said she was teaching art to kids at the community center part-time. She admitted it didn't pay much, but she liked it, the steadiness of it. The lack of pretense. I told her about the bikes I'd been working on, about the garage, about how life had simplified since Claire left. She nodded like she already understood without needing the details. That became our routine. A couple of times a week, we'd cross paths at the diner, sometimes talk, sometimes just share the space. No performance, no searching for deeper meaning. Just two people sitting comfortably in their own quiet. Claire used to fill silence with words, long, dramatic ones about freedom and self-discovery. Sophie didn't. She let silence breathe, and somehow that made her presence feel louder. One afternoon, I stopped by the community center to drop off some scrap wood I thought her students might use for painting. She was there, kneeling beside a kid who was struggling to draw a tree. She looked so natural in that moment, patient, focused, kind. I hadn't realized how rare that combination was until I saw it again. When she saw me, her face lit up in a way that wasn't rehearsed. She thanked me for the wood, offered me coffee from the staff room. It wasn't much, cheap instant stuff, but it tasted better than anything I'd had in months. We talked for an hour, about work, about life, about how hard it was to explain your dreams without sounding like you were selling something. She said she used to feel invisible next to Claire. I told her I used to feel exhausted beside her. We both laughed softly. There was no spark, no cinematic moment where everything shifted. It was smaller than that, and more real. In the following weeks, we kept in touch. I started helping her fix things around her small rental, a leaky faucet, a broken cabinet hinge, a flickering porch light. Nothing romantic, just acts of simple usefulness. She'd make tea while I worked, and we'd talk about everything except the people who'd once connected us. One evening, after finishing a repair on her back steps, she brought out 2 beers and we sat there watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air smelled like cut grass and motor oil, 2 scents that somehow made sense together. She said she admired how calm I was. I told her calm wasn't natural, it was earned. You spend enough time breaking your heart over someone who doesn't value it, and you either fall apart or build something new out of the wreckage. She nodded, quiet, like she knew that truth firsthand. Days turned into weeks, and before I noticed, she was part of my rhythm. A message in the morning. A shared meal after work. I'd find her notes tucked into my toolbox, reminders to drink water, or just doodles of motorcycles that looked suspiciously like mine. There was something about Sophie's simplicity that made everything else in my life sharper, more defined. When she was around, I noticed small things again: the way sunlight hit chrome, the sound of rain on the shop roof, the smell of her hair when she leaned close to look at what I was fixing. She never demanded space in my world. She just fit into it like she'd always belonged there. Meanwhile, Claire started to reappear on the edges again. Mutual friends mentioned she'd seen me and Sophie at the diner, said she looked off. Maybe she didn't like seeing me look happy, or maybe she just couldn't stand not being the center of someone's story anymore. One night I got a text from Claire. "Hey, weird question. Are you seeing someone?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about it, standing in my kitchen with the sound of rain tapping on the window. Eventually, I wrote back. "I'm spending time with someone who makes peace feel normal." No name, no explanation. Just truth. She didn't respond. A few days later, Sophie came by the shop with sandwiches and her usual calm smile. She didn't know about the text, and I didn't mention it. I didn't need to. She wasn't the kind of woman who measured her worth by someone else's shadow. That night, as we sat in the garage listening to an old record play on the radio, she looked at me and said something I didn't expect. "You know, Claire used to talk about you like you were a chapter she'd outgrown. But I think you were the whole book, she just never learned how to read it." I didn't answer. I just looked at her, and in that silence, everything finally clicked. It wasn't revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving I was worth keeping. It was about finally understanding that I always had been. Sophie didn't fix me. She just reminded me that I was never broken to begin with. That night, after she left, I walked through the house, the same one Claire once called ordinary. The dishes in the sink, the smell of oil, the hum of the refrigerator, all of it felt like home. Not perfect. Just honest. I sat down, opened a cold beer, and realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come back. It was late spring when Claire finally collided with the truth. The air had just started to smell like rain and cut grass again, that brief, forgiving season when even small towns feel new. The garage was busy, Sophie was spending more evenings at my place, and life had settled into something steady, something almost graceful. I didn't talk about Claire much. She had become part of the background noise, a faint hum you stop noticing until someone else points it out. But in small towns, history has a way of catching up with you. It started at the farmer's market. The same one where Claire and I had first met 2 years before. I hadn't planned to go, but Sophie liked buying local produce and insisted the tomatoes there actually taste like tomatoes. So we went, her in a sundress, me in a worn-out denim jacket, both of us laughing about how I was apparently aesthetic, now because I carried the basket. We stopped at a candle stall halfway down the row. I didn't even register it at first, the layout, the little handwritten poems, the scent of lavender and citrus. It was only when I heard her voice that everything clicked. Claire. She looked almost the same, maybe a little thinner, her hair shorter, eyes tired in that way that comes from too much self-searching. She blinked when she saw me, and then her gaze slid to Sophie, standing beside me with her hand resting lightly on my arm. The silence that followed could have filled a book. She tried to smile. I gave her one back, polite and calm, the same one I'd practiced months ago when she first said, "We'll always be friends though." "Hey," she said, voice thin, cracking just a little. "Didn't expect to see you here." I told her I was just picking up some things. She nodded too fast, said something about how nice it was to see me. Her eyes flicked towards Sophie again. Sophie smiled, a small, kind smile, the kind that didn't need to prove anything. Claire's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a candle. I noticed she wasn't wearing the rings she used to stack like armor. Her nails were chipped, her knuckles faintly stained with paint. "Still making candles?" I said, more as an observation than a question. She gave a nervous laugh. "Yeah, trying to keep the dream alive, you know?" I nodded. "Good for you." Then Sophie asked something simple, what the candles were made of, and Claire answered, but her voice faltered halfway through. The exchange lasted maybe a minute, but it stretched like time itself had slowed to let her realize everything she'd lost. When we walked away, I didn't look back. But Sophie did. Later she told me Claire stood there for a long time, holding that same candle, staring at nothing. That was the first tremor. The second came a week later, when Claire showed up at my shop. She didn't knock, she never used to, and old habits die hard. I looked up from an engine rebuild and saw her standing in the doorway, a ghost made of memory and regret. She said she just wanted to talk. I told her she could, but I wasn't stopping what I was doing. So she talked while I worked, words spilling like oil from a cracked line. She said she'd been lost, that the creative life wasn't what she expected. That people she thought were friends had turned on her, that she'd made mistakes. She didn't say Sophie's name, but I could feel it hanging in the air between us. When she finally did, it came out like a confession she didn't want to make. "I didn't think she was your type," she said. I kept my eyes on the carburetor. Maybe I didn't have a type. Maybe I just have peace now. That landed. She went quiet, and I could hear the sound of her breath shaking in her chest. Then, in that same quiet, she asked the question that had been eating her alive. "Do you love her?" I looked up. Her eyes were rimmed red, mascara faintly smudged, but she was still trying to look composed, still trying to be the version of herself who thought she was untouchable. "Yeah," I said. "I do." No hesitation. No softening. Claire flinched like I'd struck her. Then she laughed, brittle, too loud, and said something about how quickly I'd moved on. How she never thought I'd go for someone like Sophie. That phrase, someone like Sophie, hit a nerve. Not because it was cruel, but because it showed how little she'd learned. I straightened up, wiped my hands, and met her eyes. "Someone like Sophie," I said, "doesn't need to call herself creative to prove it. She just lives honestly. You should try it." Her face went cold. She left without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I didn't chase her. I just stood there, surrounded by the hum of machines, thinking how strange it was that the loudest ending could come wrapped in silence. For a few days, things were tense. Word got around, as it always does. People whispered, not out of cruelty, but because gossip is the local currency. Sophie heard some of it, of course. I could see it in her eyes when she came by, that quiet worry of being dragged into someone else's chaos. One evening, we sat in the shop after closing, eating takeout straight from the containers. She looked at me and said, "Are you sure you're ready for what comes with this? With her?" I knew what she meant. Claire wasn't the type to let go gracefully. I told Sophie the truth. "I'm not afraid of Claire anymore. I just don't owe her anything." She nodded and took my hand. That simple, unspoken gesture said everything: trust, understanding, and a quiet kind of love that didn't need dramatic declarations. Over the next few weeks, the storm passed. Claire stopped coming around, stopped texting. But the fallout lingered in small ways: mutual friends choosing sides, awkward silences at gatherings. Then came the final confrontation, not dramatic, not cinematic, just human. I ran into her again at a gas station on the outskirts of town. She looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't wash off. She asked how I'd been. I said I was doing fine. She nodded, swallowed hard, and said, "You look happy." "I am," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled, small, painful, real. "I guess I was wrong about ordinary," she said. And then she turned and walked away. I stood there for a while, watching her car disappear down the highway. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction. Just peace. Not the kind you win, the kind you earn. That night, Sophie came over. We sat on the porch, her head resting on my shoulder, the sound of crickets filling the quiet. She didn't ask about Claire, and I didn't bring her up. The past didn't feel like an open wound anymore. It felt like a scar, one that no longer hurt when I touched it. By summer, the whole thing had burned itself out, quietly, like a fire left to smolder in wet ashes. I didn't hear much about Claire for a while. Maybe that was her final act of grace, retreating into silence. Or maybe she just ran out of people willing to listen. Small towns don't forget, but they do move on. The gossip that once followed her like perfume started to fade. She stopped showing up at the cafe, stopped posting her carefully curated, creative journey, online. Even her art studio shut down. Rumor had it she'd missed too many payments, and the landlord finally locked her out. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even feel vindicated. It was like watching a storm drift out to sea, something destructive, yes, but distant now. Sophie heard most of it before I did. She still had a few mutual acquaintances from when they'd lived together. One of them stopped by the community center and told her that Claire had moved back into her parents' house, trying to regroup. That word, regroup, made me think of how she used to frame every mistake as an artistic phase, a necessary collapse before the next masterpiece. But this wasn't a phase. This was consequence. Sometimes the universe doesn't punish people with lightning bolts. It punishes them with clarity. And from what I heard, that's exactly what hit Claire, hard. She tried to pick up freelance work, teaching art classes, selling custom pieces online. Nothing stuck. Her followers, the ones who once cheered her self-discovery, had moved on to fresher stories. The world doesn't wait for redemption arcs, it scrolls past them. One afternoon, I stopped at the grocery store after work and saw her car in the parking lot. I almost turned around, but curiosity got the better of me. She was inside at the checkout lane, wearing the same faded jacket she'd once called vintage chic. Her hair was tied back, her face bare, her expression small. I might not have recognized her if it weren't for the way she still bit her lip when she was nervous. When she turned and saw me, something flickered across her face, surprise, then embarrassment, then resignation. She didn't speak. Just nodded. I nodded back. That was all. It was strange, the absence of anger. A year earlier, I might have imagined a grand confrontation, some cathartic speech about betrayal and closure. But standing there, watching her load groceries into her old sedan, I realized I didn't need it. I didn't even want it. She'd already said everything she needed to say through her choices. That night, I told Sophie about seeing her. She didn't react much, just listened. That's what she did best. She asked me how I felt. I said, lighter. She smiled softly. That's what healing sounds like. Over the next few months, I saw evidence of Claire's unraveling everywhere, though not directly. The candle shop she'd started had closed. Her old friends had drifted off. Someone mentioned she was working part-time at a craft supply store, the same one she used to shop at when she still believed she was destined for something bigger. I didn't feel pity, but I didn't feel pride either. I just felt distance, the clean kind that time builds when you finally stop reaching backward. But there's a strange kind of justice that comes from simply not showing up anymore. From refusing to be the safety net someone assumes you'll always be. Claire had spent years calling herself a free spirit, and maybe she was, but freedom without responsibility is just chaos dressed up in pretty words. She learned that lesson the hard way. Meanwhile, life with Sophie became quietly full. She moved in around late July. Not officially, not with boxes and announcements, just gradually. One toothbrush became two. One cup of coffee became a morning ritual for both of us. She fit into my life the way a missing bolt fits back into an old engine, naturally, perfectly, like it had always belonged there. We rebuilt the spare room into an art space, though she laughed when I called it that. I don't make art, she said. You do, I told her. You just make it out of steadiness instead of paint. She blushed, but I meant it. Sometimes, when she'd sit reading while I worked in the garage, I'd glance over and feel something I hadn't in years, peace that didn't come with conditions. No pretense, no performance. Just two people existing side by side, each doing what they loved. One evening, while cleaning out an old storage cabinet, I found a box of Claire's things, forgotten canvases, brushes, and a few of those candles she used to make. The scent hit me immediately, lavender and something sharp underneath. It used to remind me of her, now it just smelled like the past. I took the box out behind the garage and lit one of the candles. The wax melted fast, dripping over the edge, the flame wavering in the summer air. I didn't make a speech or think of poetic closure. I just watched it burn until nothing was left but the wick and a faint trail of smoke curling into the night. That was the real revenge, not fire or bitterness, but indifference. Sophie came out to join me, barefoot on the cool concrete. She didn't ask what I was doing. She didn't need to. She just stood next to me, quiet, watching the flame die out. It was the first time I truly understood what balance felt like. Because the truth is, revenge isn't about making someone else hurt. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself you gave away for free. Claire lost her sense of control the moment she realized I wouldn't play my old role anymore. The provider, the rescuer, the man she could count on while pretending she didn't need anyone. She wanted friendship on her terms. What she got instead was reality on mine. By August, I stopped hearing her name altogether. She became just another person I used to know, a story I'd tell in my head sometimes, not with anger, but as a reminder. Sophie and I started planning a trip then, nothing big, just a ride along the coast on the rebuilt Bonneville. I'd finally finished it, and it felt like more than a machine now. It felt like a metaphor that actually ran on gas. The morning we left, I looked around the house once, the walls, the shelves, the faint smell of oil and coffee, and realized how much had changed without fanfare. The past wasn't gone. It was just finally in the right place, behind me. A year passes quietly when you're no longer fighting ghosts. Sometimes I forget that Claire ever lived in this house. The echoes of her footsteps are gone. Even her favorite mug has disappeared somewhere between yard sales and spring cleanings. The walls have been repainted a warm cream color that Sophie picked out, soft, simple, the color of peace. The garage still smells like oil and rust, but now there's laughter in it too. Sophie likes to sit out there with me while I work, reading or sketching on an old stool I fixed for her. She says the noise of my tools helps her think. I say it keeps me from thinking too much. We've fallen into a rhythm that doesn't need words. Mornings start with coffee and a slow song from the old radio on the counter. Evenings end with her head on my shoulder and the soft hum of cicadas through the window. No drama. No speeches about creative souls or finding ourselves. Just life, real and steady. Sometimes we ride the Bonneville out past the edge of town, where the road cuts through fields and the sky feels bigger than it should. She leans against me, her arms wrapped around my waist, her laughter carried by the wind. It's simple. It's everything. There's a kind of magic in simplicity, though you never see it when you're young. Back then, I thought love had to be loud, something you fought for, something that burned. But now I know better. The real thing is quieter. It stays. I heard about Claire once, through a friend of a friend. She'd moved to the city, started working at a small crafts shop. Apparently she's doing okay, whatever that means. No more grand projects, no more poetic monologues about art and freedom. Just a regular job, a regular life. Maybe she finally found the balance she was chasing, or maybe she's still looking. I don't wish her ill. I just don't wish her much at all. Because the truth is, forgiveness doesn't always mean reaching out. Sometimes it means walking forward and not turning around. When I think about everything that happened, it doesn't feel like revenge anymore. It feels like reclamation. I didn't destroy her world, I just stopped building it for her. That's what she never understood. Claire used to believe she was special because she lived outside the lines. Sophie, on the other hand, never tried to be special, and maybe that's what makes her extraordinary. She doesn't need to invent herself every morning. She just shows up, honest and unpolished, and somehow that's more beautiful than anything Claire ever painted. One night, near the end of summer, Sophie and I sat on the porch with 2 glasses of whiskey and the kind of silence that feels like conversation. The air was thick with the smell of rain and cut grass. She said, Do you ever think about how different everything turned out? I thought about that for a while before answering. Sometimes. But I think it turned out exactly how it needed to. She smiled, that small, knowing smile she gets when she agrees but doesn't need to say it. Later, after she went to bed, I stayed outside, staring at the stars. They looked the same as they did the night Claire left, distant, unreachable, quietly burning. The difference was, I didn't feel small beneath them anymore. I felt grounded. The truth about endings is they don't arrive all at once. They fade in slowly, like dawn. You wake up one day and realize you're not angry anymore, not waiting for closure, not wondering what went wrong. You just breathe, deeply, easily, and realize you've made it through. That's where I am now. The shop's doing better than ever. Word's gotten around that I specialize in vintage bikes, and people come from out of town just to see the work. I've even started teaching a couple of teenagers the basics, kids who remind me of myself back when I still thought fixing machines was just a job, not a way of understanding people. Sophie says the garage is my art studio. I laugh, but I think she's right. The difference is, my art actually runs when I'm done. Sometimes, I still catch faint traces of the man I used to be, the one who mistook loyalty for love, who thought patience could fix selfishness. I don't hate that version of me. He needed to exist so I could learn how to stop carrying other people's burdens. And as for Claire, well, I guess she taught me one last lesson, even if she didn't mean to. When someone says, "We'll always be friends though," what they often mean is, "I want to keep the parts of you that serve me." And the best way to answer that is to smile and redefine what friendship means, for yourself. So that's what I did. Now I wake up next to someone who doesn't measure me against her ambitions. Someone who doesn't confuse chaos for passion. Someone who finds beauty in the ordinary, the same way I do. I used to think revenge was about payback. Turns out, it's about peace. And peace, I've learned, is the most satisfying ending of all.